Hey guys, welcome back. Alrighty, lecture 3 from chapter 1, Spirits in the Material World. Alrighty, so as I go through chapter 1, I see in a little beyond where you are right now seeing this video, they will talk a little bit about the history of psychology and some of the relevant psychologists and movements and such that happened, but they start mostly from the birth of psychology. And I think there's an important story, a sort of backstory, an origin story, as it were, that just helps us all understand why things happened when they did and what the scientific context was. And so that's what I want to tell you about a little bit today. I was thinking about calling this lecture when philosophers and biologists party together or something like that, because you'll see it really is a story of some of the first philosophical context that led or that allowed the birth of psychology, but then how some findings from biology really kind of made that more powerful. Okay, so let's walk through it. I call this spirits in the material world, but we'll get to that point. I want to start here. So what this is here is just sort of a timeline of science, of different sciences. And the point we want to make here is that when it comes to scientific research, that's been around forever. If we go into more like physics and chemistry, we see, things were happening way, way back, many, many, many years ago. In philosophy, of course, we're going to go back BC when we talk about things, but even like the telescope was invented in 1600s, and some of the Aristotle's work in the 1700s we're seeing here. Chemistry as well, was it was back in the days of alchemy and such. There was chemistry obviously going on, and the formal study was going on all for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Biology, a little newer, the formal study of biology. If we go back, certainly people were like breeding racehorses and stuff like that, which implied a certain knowledge of biology and how things work. But in terms of the sort of formal study of biology, we see more around the 1600s, especially with the invention of the microscope. So still, a good 400 plus years of history in psychology. And when you look in this context, in biology, when you look at this context, where does psychology fit in? Well, as a formal discipline, it really kicks in around 1878. So just in the last 150 years. It's very young. It's a very new science. And one of the questions I want to address in this lecture is, why did it take us humans so long to become scientifically interested in ourselves? We were interested in the world via physics. We were interested in matter in terms of chemistry. We were interested in the animals and plants of the world in terms of biology. But it took us a long, long time to start thinking of ourselves as potential subjects of scientific inquiry. Why? That brings us back to the spirits in the material world. And it largely, reflects a lot of religious beliefs of the time, where we really saw ourselves as distinct. We saw ourselves as being made in the image of God and being infused with a soul, a spirituality. And what made the spirituality distinct is it was not material. We were in a material world, right? The things out the window. If you see me looking this way, sometimes that's my window. And so I can see grass and trees and cars, and I live in a subdivision, so houses, etc., etc. Those are all made of stuff that's been put together in certain ways to create what we see. And so physical, material matter. But the notion is, yes, we have a physicality, we have a body, but a lot of people thought, really what's controlling this body, us, the us inside of this, is a spirit, is a soul, is something that is not physical, beyond the physical. Okay, and so here's just a quote from Alan Moore as an example. There are two worlds we live in: a material world bounded by the laws of physics, and the world inside our mind, which is just as important. What he's implying is that the world inside our mind is not bounded by physics, or if we want to say more generally, is not subject to natural laws, right? And that's what science is about. So this is the really important point I want to get across. Science is all about figuring out the rules that matter has to live by, the so-called natural laws of things. What determines. So, for example, we can't just throw a potato out the window and expect it to go up. Right? That would defy the law of gravity. And so that we've discovered these certain laws, these rules that all matter has to sort of abide by. And that's what science is about, is trying to discover these rules. Well, if the mind is not material, if it's not physical, then it doesn't have to follow any rules, any natural laws. And therefore, it doesn't really make sense to apply science to it. Right? Because if it's not following any natural laws, and if science is about uncovering the natural laws that something follows, well, it seems like a losing game right from the start, right? And this is for a large reason why hundreds and hundreds of years went by and we never really thought to kind of study ourselves. Now, while that time was going by, though, there was a rumbling that started to set the stage for a different way of thinking about things. And so let's go there a little bit. And let's start way back. So let's start with Aristotle, just for context as much as anything. But Aristotle, was thinking about different living entities, plants, animals, humans, and trying to think how they were similar or how they were different. And he came up with this sort of way of thinking about things. He talked about them all as having a soul. He's using the word soul in a very general way, as you'll see here. But plants have a vegetative soul. That means they are really focused on reproduction and growth. Those are the two things important to something with a vegetative soul. And so plants are all about, taking nutrients in from the roots, getting the sunshine from the sun, and using those nutrients with photosynthesis and other processes to what? To grow and to reproduce. And that's what it's all about to be a plant. Okay. Now, animals, he described as having a sensitive soul. So animals were, in Aristotle's mind, much more sensitive to the world and reactive to the world, right? So they moved. That was an important distinction. That's how they're different than plants. I mean, plants move a little bit, but they don't, move in the dynamic, animated way that animals move. And so he said animals were all about sensing the environment, looking for things like food, evading predators. And so it was all about watching what's out in the environment and behaving accordingly. And he called that a sensitive soul. But he thought, they were doing this in a very mechanical way, instinctual way, reflexive way, that there's just certain behaviors, like, if a food source was there, the natural behavior would be to go and eat the food source. If there was a predator present, the natural behavior would be to flee the predator. So the animal would just see the predator and that instinct would kick in. Okay. Humans, he thought, were different. Humans had what he called a rational soul. And so he thought humans were capable of thought and reflection in a way that animals simply were not. And so that, humans weren't doing things because it was a reflex or just anything like that, but rather they considered the options and chose their behaviors according to a rational thought process. Okay, so that's his sort of distinction of the difference. Okay, so with that as context, let's now talk about the really critical player. And you've heard about this guy in your readings, Rene Descartes. I like the story of Rene Descartes. And I like telling you the story of Rene Descartes because it's a fun one. And so the story I like to tell goes like this. Rene, of course, was a philosopher and a mathematician. He was one of those people who was doing crazy intellectual work at like 17, 18, 19 years old already. But somewhere around that time, he also, Rene, like a lot of people who are different, unique, interesting, had trouble fitting in sometimes with society. And he would have what they called at that time mental breakdowns, or times when he was struggling with life, to be quite honest. And on one of these occasions, a doctor that he spoke to recommended that he take some time off, relax a little bit, go to Paris, enjoy the gardens, just kind of unwind, stop thinking all the time, Rene. And so Rene did that. He went to Paris, and in fact, he went to a new, let's call it, display at the Versailles Palace, where they were showing something that nobody had seen before, and he wanted to see it. So he was walking through this garden. This garden, being a French garden, featured, of course, a lot of beautiful plants, but also a lot of statues, right? A lot of art. And, okay, here was the unique thing. As Rene was walking through, he saw ahead of him this statue of Diana, goddess of the hunt. Beautiful statue. And so he wanted to come look at it closer. As he advanced the path, as he walked down the path towards that statue, though, something really shocking happened. Out from behind the bushes to his right came another statue, and it rolled right in front of him, and it was the statue of Neptune holding up a trident up in front of him, and basically barring Rene's path, as if to say, no, you will not pass. Okay, I am guarding the statue of Princess Diana. Okay, unless you missed it, the critical thing I just said there is a statue moved. Okay, a statue came from out behind bushes and did so with seeming intention, as though it was trying to foil Rene. This blew Rene's mind. He did not listen to the doctor who said, stop thinking for a while. He started thinking about this. Why did it blow his mind? Well, it blew his mind because, kind of like Aristotle, Rene had always thought before that movement was important, and that movement implied some level of a soul. So, Aristotle's got this notion of animals having this sensitive soul. Rene also had thought at that point, before watching the statue, that anything that moved must have some sort of soul that's moving it. But with the statue, he said, well, but wait a minute, that statue is a hunk of stone. But it moved, and it moved with seeming intention. But I know it does not have a soul. It's a hunk of stone. It does not have a soul. So first of all, let me just give you sort of what's the magic. How did that work? So what this was a demonstration of a really kind of cool new idea at the time, an idea called hydraulics. And so how it actually worked is, as Rene was walking down the path, he stepped on a pressure plate, and the weight of his body pushed a bunch of water through a tube with a strong force, which was enough to push this statue, which was on some sort of frictionless wheels, or frictionless as close as they could get, low friction thing, so that it would easily slide out. And so the weight of Rene's body is what actually moved the statue. And that's what they were showing off in this new place, is this new principle of hydraulics and how it could work. But of course, for Rene, the important thing was he just witnessed something that did not have a soul, but that acted and moved as though it had intention. And so what Rene concluded from this is that suddenly he thought animals are like that statue. Animals do not have a soul. You do not need to have a soul to move in a seemingly intentional way. And so just because animals seem like they have goals, like they're trying to get food, they're trying to avoid predation, they're trying to mate, they're trying to whatever, that doesn't mean they have a soul. And in fact, from that point on, Rene said animals do not have a soul. And it's because of him that we have so much animal research now, which is an issue we'll discuss at some point in this course. I won't discuss it now. And so then what of humans? So Rene said, okay, when it comes to humans, now there's controversy over this. Some people said Rene said what he said because he had to say it at the time. If he had said humans don't have a soul, that humans are just responding to stimuli in the environment, that would not have gone over well at his time. The church was very powerful. The church had a big investment in the soul, and they didn't like the idea of discounting the soul. But so what Rene said instead, he came up with this notion of dualism. He said, unlike animals, humans have a mind. Animals he didn't think have a mind. Animals just had a body that reacted mechanically, a really fancy, complex biological machine. That's what he imagined animals to be. Humans, he said, are two things. So this is where we're going to get into the dualism. They have that machine-like part. That's their body. It's physical, but it also can react to things in an instinctual, automatic ways. So he started to say, there is part of us is like the animal. We are, in a sense, like an animal, but we have something they don't, and that is a mind. And the mind is where the spirit lives, and the spirit is able to control the body. So suddenly he said there are two different sources controlling the body. There is the animal side, that biological part, and some of the behaviors a human does is a reflection of that, primitive animal side of them, whereas others are a result of the mind. Back to sort of more Aristotle's rational thought. So unlike Aristotle, he kind of saw humans as part animal, but also the ability to control that part of them with the mind. And that notion has become to be known Cartesian dualism. That's what we call that. Dual nature to humans, too. Why is this important to spirits in the material world? Well, because Rene was saying that at least to some extent, there is a physical part to being a human being. There is a physicality, and at least that part then we could study scientifically. We might never be able to study the mind scientifically, but we could at least study the rest of us and how that works. So Rene opened the door to us beginning to think of ourselves as something that could be studied scientifically. Now, Rene's still in the 1600s, right? And I told you it's 200 years later before psychology happens. So Rene was just setting the seeds. Now, those seeds kind of grew. There was a lot of debate in the philosophical community over this issue. Are the mind and body distinct and non-identical entities, as Rene Descartes would say with dualism? Or are they actually manifestations of the single thing? Does the mind, we hear sometimes things like mind is what the brain does. And so that the mind emerges from the processing of the brain, which we think is just a physical thing, like the rest of the body, right? And so this has led to the notion of what's sometimes called materialism. Materialism is an extreme version, so it's an extreme contrast to dualism. Materialism says there is just a single substance and it's physical. So if we kind of go back to the Aristotle and the Descartes, the materialist is saying there's not really a distinction between animals and humans. There may be distinction of complexity. Humans may think much more complex thoughts. They may show much more complex behavior than most animals do. But at their core, we're the same thing. We're all physical beings. There is no spirit in the material world. There's just material. This thing that we call the mind emerges from physical stuff. That view, that strong materialist view, says, okay then, well, if everything about a human is physical, then it must follow laws of science, and therefore we can study those laws scientifically. Okay? So logically, when the philosophers were kind of flirting with these ideas of materialism, they were opening the door potentially to the notion of scientific studying of the mind. Okay. With that door kind of out there then, it's now important to highlight the role a couple of biologists played in this. And I want to start with Luigi Galvani. So Luigi Galvani, 1700s. Let me just mention, by the way, this was a time when people did science for fun. They didn't do science. It was a hobby. There were no formal, research institutes like we have today. Professors didn't have labs at the university. No, they had labs in their basement. And you'll see, if you look at movies set at this point in time, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, anything like that, you will see that a common depiction is the person going down to their lab in their basement, because people were doing it for fun. It was hobbies. And Luigi was one of these people. Now, these people who were doing the science for fun would get together every now and then at the Academy of the Sciences, and they would show off for each other. Look, I did this cool experiment, and I want to show it to you. It's really fascinating. And so Luigi famously did one of these presentations. And basically, his presentation, as depicted over on the right here, was as follows. He went in front of everybody. My best Luigi Galvani. I don't know if I could do a Luigi Galvani accent, but if I can. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you today. See what I have here. I have a frog. Well, no, I don't have a whole frog. I just have him from the hips down. Just the 2 frog legs. So I would first like to ask people in the audience, does anybody here think this frog has a living soul right now? Anybody? Anybody? And people are like, no, there's no soul in that frog. Man, it's just legs. Okay, cool. And so then what he did is he showed that if you passed electrical current, and so this is a weird little device. He actually used static electricity. You can almost imagine it as like 2 leads on a battery. But what he showed is if you pass electricity through here, the legs kick. So you see in the back there, that sort of kick thing. And if you let the electricity go, they straighten out again. Touch it with electricity, they kick. So you can see, I can make the frog leg dance. This is a dancing frog leg, but there's no soul. So what Luigi showed is that a frog's body seems to be an electrical machine of a sort. Muscles seem to respond to electricity, and that causes movement. And you can have, again, movement with the pure absence of a soul. It's like he's showing the machine of the human body in action. And so people left that going, wow, we are kind of machines. Interesting. And they started thinking about their whole bodies. But then a lot of people said, okay, hang on. That's an animal. We've all kind of agreed for a long time that animals are maybe sort of machine-like. That's not a human, though. Enter Paul Broka. Paul Broka is sometimes called the most patient scientist in the world. Paul was actually a medical doctor, and he was clever because he noticed as he visited various patients, he would come across a number of patients who had the same odd behavior. When you spoke to them, they could understand language perfectly well. You could say, hey, could you go get that coffee cup and hand it to me, please? And they would go get the coffee cup and they would hand it to you. But when they tried to speak, even though the words were kind of right, they never made any sense. They didn't put things together in a way that made any sense to the listener. It's like they couldn't express their ideas in words. And so Paul thought, that's kind of interesting. I've seen a bunch of these people. So for each one of them, he said, hey, I got this question to ask you. It's kind of uncomfortable, but I'm going to ask it anyway. One day you're going to die. Sorry, but it's true. You are. And when that day comes, would you give me permission to look at your brain? I would like to take a look at your brain. And somehow he got a bunch of people to give him permission. And so what did he do then? Well, he waited. He waited till they died. Eventually they died. And when they died, he opened their skull, looked at their brain, and what he saw is that every one of them had damage to this area of their brain, which is now called Broca's area. And so what he started to say is, okay, this part of the brain, this part of brain tissue seems critical to that ability to express our ideas in words. This part of the brain is doing that somehow. And so once again, he's kind of showing the machinery of, well, in this case, the human brain, which is about as close to mind as you can get. And he's starting to show the human brain has what's called a localized structure. We know this now. We know that specific parts of the brain, this motor cortex, you'll learn more about this, but this is responsible for actions. This part of the brain is responsible, Wernicke's area, for understanding words, understanding sentences when someone speaks to you. And so Broka was the one that started to suggest, hey, even us, even we seem like biological machinery, and all this cool stuff we can do, like talk to one another and interact, it seems to all come from that biological substance. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean everybody became a materialist after these. In fact, a lot of scientists today continue to have spiritual beliefs, but they certainly believe whatever they are studying does conform to natural laws. So, if you're studying consciousness, for example, human consciousness, you're assuming consciousness arises somehow out of what the brain does, and that you can learn, you can figure that out. So all of this kind of eroded that notion of us being some special spiritual entity. And more we started to see ourselves as a material entity, at least in part. And that opened the door to the scientific study of ourselves. And so we're up with Broka to sort of 1880s, which is sort of around, you're going to see 1878, that, somewhere around here is where psychology was born. And so that's the context in which it was born, a context where people were starting to think of themselves as open to scientific inquiry. And without that, I don't think we would have ever had psychology. Okay, that's it for this lecture. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.